Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a principal engineer at the Financial Times. I've been programming in Java for 15 years, Go for about a year. I'm currently the platform tech lead for our content and metadata platform at the FT. Principal engineers at the FT are expected to take on areas of responsibility, and over the last couple of years, for me, that's been DevOps. I've been working with a new team that have been trying to put operability at the forefront of everything we're doing. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So why the title? This is a quote from one of the people in our operations team. And really, you can understand that when you work in operations and you work on an on-call pattern where you're paid to be on call and you get paid when you are called, that you would wonder why on earth would anyone who's a developer agree to do this kind of thing for free? Well, why would people even expect it to be for free? Well, for us at the FT, we have a lot of different programs, platforms, services. We have lots of different things people are building, and it would be quite hard to have a small group of developers supporting all of these. So you end up with a lot of groups of developers all doing support. And from the company's point of view, they really don't want to pay for that, because probably each one of those might have one call a year. So they've got to find ways to persuade us that we want to do that support without being paid. And I think to get the answer to that, you have to work out what DevOps gives you. So this boring title is what I could have had as the title, which is basically what have I learned about doing DevOps at the FT. So I'm going to do 3 sections. I'm going to talk about why we adopted DevOps, what were the conditions that let us do it. Then I'm going to talk about how we approach that. And finally, I'm going to talk about the hard stuff, because there is hard stuff around doing this. And I think that's where it's interesting for people. So first off, why DevOps? But before I do that, just say a little bit about the Financial Times. So I imagine most people know the Financial Times is a newspaper. It's the pink paper, does business news. This is the latest version of our website. But it's interesting, when you look at the Financial Times About Us page, it says one of the world's leading business news and information organizations. That doesn't say anything about a newspaper. And the reason for that is most people who read the Financial Times are not doing it from paper. They're reading from our website, from our mobile app. They are reading something in Flipboard or through Facebook or Google AMP. Maybe they're getting our content through B2B partners that slice our content and serve it to people that are interested in particular stuff. So actually, there are lots of ways that we send our content out into the world, and they all are based on technology. New media knows how to move fast when it needs to do things. Traditional media is under threat. We need to be able to move at least as fast as the people in new media. So why did we think DevOps would help us to move fast in the work that we do? Well, the simple answer is that's what people who do DevOps say. So this is the slide from the State of DevOps report from this year. Basically, they talk to lots of people who are doing DevOps, and they work out what things fit together. So if you're deploying frequently, it turns out you tend to get changes out really quickly, and you're able to recover quickly. And also, the interesting thing is, the things you do put out fail much less, because every change is small. It's really easy to work out whether it's working or not. And we look at that and we say, well, we want to do that. But it isn't as simple as saying, right, we're doing DevOps, here's a DevOps team, have some money, do some tooling. Because doing DevOps properly means changing your culture, and cultural change is hard. You can't expect to bring everyone with you. And people are going to get upset, and they're going to be really worried about things. So you have to work at that. So what motivated us to change? Well, one thing that helped was people were quite annoyed with the way things were. So everything was really slow. When I joined the FT 6 years ago, it took months to get a production server ready. You spec'd it out, someone ordered it, it came in, they set it up. It was 3 months for the first project I worked on. It took days to get a release ready, because lots of parts of doing that were manual. So I had a look and I found this, which is a diagram of our release process from 2013. So I wouldn't look at the details, but one thing I would say is everything gets grouped together. So there's a bunch of stories that get developed, and then they are put into a cut. And then there's a lot of testing around that. And then you have to get it scheduled to get out the door. And because very often when we did these kind of releases, they went wrong, we always had to test rollbacks. And I don't know about you, but rollbacks never work, basically. They never work first time. You test it, that doesn't work, you test it again. So it's no wonder it took us ages to get things out of the door. It took hours to actually do that release, because we had monolithic applications, SQL servers, a schema change would take a long time. And because it took hours, we had to arrange to do those releases at a time that suited editorial, which turned out to be for 3 hours on a Saturday once a month, which meant we would do work in sprints, we were agile, but you wouldn't get any feedback about whether what you'd done was useful for 6 weeks, maybe 12 weeks. So our processes were manual, which means they were error-prone. Because each server was set up individually, they were Snowflake servers. You could not guarantee that a test server would have the same version of Java as a production server. And that means you go out to live and things go wrong that you weren't expecting. Our release instructions were in a spreadsheet. I reviewed these spreadsheets on quite a lot, and I never saw one that had no errors in it. I used to be a proofreader, so I'd be like, this doesn't make sense. This is 6 steps of a 54-step spreadsheet for releasing the application. You can't probably see the detail, but lots of these are, go onto these 4 boxes, run this script. Go onto another 4 boxes, run this script. The only reason it worked at all was the people doing the releases really knew the systems inside out. But of course, it was laborious. And I was part of one release that took 24 hours. And actually, after 4 hours, we started rolling back. So 20 hours of that were trying to roll back to the state we were in beforehand. So, if you talk to anyone at the FT at this point, it was just painful. And releasing was quite literally a box-ticking exercise. We had a build and deployment system that was incredibly customizable. And one of the things you had to do was you had to get another developer to check a box to say, yes, I've validated that this is a sensible release. But there was so much code in any of the releases, you couldn't possibly expect to do that. So you would be asked to check the box by a colleague and you'd do it. Similarly, we had to have the same thing done by someone from QA. So this was just adding extra process for no additional guarantees of quality at all. So we had some preconditions pushing us towards trying something different, but we also had some other things that were pulling us in that direction. And the first thing was a change in how the FT as a business thought about technology. And apparently around this time, our board and our CEO started talking about Kodak and how Kodak knew that digital cameras were the future. Unfortunately, they totally failed to execute on that, which meant they lost out massively. So they were saying, we do not want to be the newspaper that knows where we need to go, but can't execute it. So they basically said to technology, you need to take risks. You need to help us move in the right direction. And as part of that, people from technology department were now on the board for the first time. Our CIO and our chief data officer were on the board. So technology is now right in the middle of decisions that we're making at the company. Around the same time, we also brought in a new CTO and a new CIO. And one of the things they suggested, this is a slide from the CTO's presentation from a few years ago, was that we should be building platforms with APIs, and then we can build whichever products we like on the top of it. So that seemed like a really sensible thing for us to be doing. And we had 3 big, complex new things we wanted to do. We wanted to rebuild our website to be responsive and data-driven from the start. We wanted to build a complex content and metadata system with APIs that would support that website. And we also wanted to replace an old monolithic subscription system with something that was much more easy to work with and change. And we wanted to do all of these as microservices. But there is no way you can do microservices if you have to set up servers manually. So because there was a lot of support from the organization to take these new approaches, we had support for doing the necessary changes to our processes and culture to do it. And the final thing that really helped was that we had a company called Asanka who built the FT's first web app. They were a small company. They didn't have a separate operations and development. And because they weren't part of the FT, they didn't follow any of our processes. So they got a reputation for doing things quickly. And also people noticed that even though they didn't go through all these quality gates, they still got things out and didn't have anywhere near the number of issues that other people had. We bought Asanka. A lot of those people came in-house. So we now had an example where people had done this and it hadn't all burnt down. So those are the conditions that pushed us towards trying something new and that gave us the support for it to be DevOps. And I think if you're going to do a transition to DevOps successfully, you have to have support from the top level. Because when people get upset or they don't want to do something, someone has to say, no, this is how we're going to do it. So how do we approach doing DevOps? Well, we did the same first thing a lot of people do. We thought, oh, we'll do some automation. It isn't hard to convince people that rather than having someone manually typing at command line, we ought to make some scripts. So that's what we started with. And we had a team that set up an FT platform with the idea being, well, we want people to be able to deploy new applications to production in 15 minutes. And they were using Puppet. They had a lot of structure around that to help teams. And this meant, for the first time, developers could provision a VM, which makes a lot of difference. And the platform had built-in support for things that were going to matter for us to be able to do operability. So, for example, if you deployed a VM using FT platform, you automatically got monitoring with Nagios. So you couldn't actually turn that off. So you were going to have some view on your system. Similarly, your logs would be forwarded to Splunk, so you got log aggregation. And just by making that part of the platform, all of the teams now have things that are common and that give them insight into their systems. So the first thing was automation and infrastructure as code. And the next thing that really we had to work around DevOps was collaboration. Because when we started this, we very definitely had an operations department and a development department. I'd been at the FT 4 years before I got to know anyone in operations by name, because that's when we started doing this transition. And this is what it used to look like. So we had operations. They were first-line support. They work on a shift. They're sat in front of a bank of monitors, and when things go red, they restart servers, they escalate to third parties, they phone people. Tech ops were our second-line support. They are also part of operations, but they know more about the systems. So they're able to go onto a box and work out something's going wrong because of the logs. They were also the people that did all our releases, and they were also the people that set up all the monitoring for our system. So as a development team, you did some work, you got something ready, you threw it to operations, and they operationalized it. So the very first thing we did was we just moved those tech ops people and we put them into our teams. So now they were part of the team, and you were talking to them every day. So they weren't those people over there, they were the people sat right with you, and you were all working together to try and make these systems able to be operated. And we could get them to review stuff that we were producing, documentation, alerts, and they'd tell us whether it made sense. And also, they started to trust that we had the right intentions around the work we were doing. So that was a good thing for collaboration. We also started to set up groups of people around common interests, like a forum around monitoring, which was a mix of people from operations and development. We did this for several things, and we'd meet up and talk about how we wanted things to work and the problems that we had with it. And they lasted as long as it took before you felt you'd got an approach for this problem. So it went on for 6 months, and then we stopped meeting. So the third aspect of moving to DevOps, you build it, you run it. And I think if you don't do that, you aren't doing DevOps. And I'm going to talk later about what I think that means for out-of-hours support. But basically, if you aren't the person that's dealing with bad documentation, flaky systems, thousands of alerts, then you're not going to fix it. You're not going to care enough about it. So you have to have your development teams doing this. So funnily enough, when developers have to support a system, they'll really focus on building stuff for operability. So we were building microservices. Very quickly, we realized that we wanted to be able to trace a request through our entire stack. So we had transaction IDs, and we put them into everything. We really focused on how our monitoring worked, because we were the people getting all of these alerts. I got 10,000 alerts when a Puppet master was restarted, and I was just like, okay, we have to do something about that. It's ridiculous. And it's interesting, because it changes your job as a developer quite a lot. Because actually programming now, particularly microservices, the programming part isn't the problem. Everything else is the problem. You're probably going to spend most of your time not cutting code, and for a lot of people, that's a real change. And also, for quite a few developers, they're not comfortable doing sysadmin-y stuff. They've not been on the command line focusing on fixing things, and they're a bit concerned about that. So you do have to give support to people when you make this change. One thing we found was the FT came up with an engineering checklist, which just provided a set of things you ought to consider in building a system and making it operable. And that started, the very beginning was, do you even need to build this? Could you buy something in that does what you need? And it went through various things around security. We talk about monitoring, alerting, runbooks. And it's just something to consider so that you don't forget some key aspect, because you're relatively new to this. And this is the latest version of it. It's basically, you can go through and read bits of it, and there's supporting documentation behind it. And it's the responsibility of our QA teams to make sure that the products that we're building have had this considered. And it is completely acceptable to say, we're not doing monitoring. This is just a utility that we're going to use, and we don't care if it falls over. We turn it on once a month. It's perfectly okay to do that, but you ought to have considered it. So the way that my team started getting involved in running our systems was we just did it in hours. We were building a new system. It wasn't fully live. This just made sense. Didn't have to have any debates about contracts. So we started doing that, and we found it was a little bit overwhelming. So what we very quickly did was within a team, we would have someone who was the ops cop. So you're on the rota for a week, and it's your job to respond to anything that goes wrong in terms of operations. So something goes red for our stuff, you're the one that reacts to it. That lets the other developers carry on with their work without being distracted. But the ops cop doesn't have to solve everything. They can just get other people to help, but they need to respond. And the other thing we did that was really important is we added a lane on our Kanban board for things around operability. And the reason that's important is if you're expecting developers to support a system, you have to let them do the work to make it supportable. So your product owner can't spend their time saying, no, I'm sorry, I want you to do functionality. And by having a lane on the board, it means that you've always got something there that's showing the time that you're spending on things other than functional delivery. And that's, I think, been really crucial for us. One thing we've done as the ops cops work, they tend to improve things as they go. And one of the things we're trying to do is make it very easy to work out what's gone wrong. And with microservices, we've found that it's very easy to see that a particular microservice is wrong, but it's quite hard to tell what the impact is of that. So we've got dashboards for our various systems. We've started to move to having ones that are talking about the business functionality. So on the top right, we say, well, okay, is list read healthy? Can I read lists from the APIs? And next to it, can I publish them? Because that lets you know which bits of the business are affected by a particular service being down. And if services are down but none of the business stuff is affected, that's fine. I don't really want to be woken up for that. The last 2 years, I think I've said, I don't want to be woken up at 2 in the morning for this, more times than I've said anything else. Because we want to know about things quickly, we have alerts that are business level alerts. We have them come into Slack, into a special prod incidents channel that our ops cops are monitoring. So we can quickly react to stuff and say, yeah, we need to do this. One thing we found is when you're building a system based on microservices, that there's a lot of different microservices and you can't possibly all know them. So you need to find ways to share knowledge about those services. One of the other programs at the FT has what they call a curriculum, where they've listed all the services and they get every developer and tester to rate themselves from, I've never even heard of this, to I regularly commit on this. And that way you can look at that and you can say, we've got an area there where we're really quite exposed. We don't have anyone that understands that. And I think it's a great idea and one that I'm planning to copy for my program as well. Mostly we do documentation at a service level because the closer that the documentation is to the code, the more likely people will update it. So we have READMEs for every service and our tests act as documentation. But for business level stuff, you can't do that. So we do have these ops guides that are basically, what is this thing? How will I know it's not working? What actions can I take to try and fix it? And then we also have run books for every individual service that is literally just saying, here's who you should talk to. Here's where it sits in the rest of this particular platform. And the thing about these is they're only as good they're only good if they're up to date. And that requires people to spend the time to do it. So you have to make it part of doing every bit of work that you check whether it's had an impact on this documentation. It's something that we ask our QA teams to do. Developers don't really like doing documentation, but they probably prefer doing a bit all along rather than spend a month solidly updating everything at some point. So you can normally persuade people to do it. So that's why DevOps and also how we did it, but I want to talk about the hard stuff. It's a culture change. That is the most difficult thing about changing to work in a different way. And if you don't do that, you don't get all the benefits. Was touched on in a previous talk, but operations have spent their entire career stopping developers from putting stuff live and breaking things. So you have to work to make them trust you. If you want to deploy it all the time, you need to convince operations that it's very low risk to do that. And this is something that we struggled with. So when I was first able to provision a VM, I didn't actually have permissions to deploy my application to it. I would have to find someone who was a sysadmin to do that. Well, that's completely ludicrous. As a developer, why would you let me create a VM but not put some running code on it? But from the operations point of view, yeah, why would I let you do that? And it took time to kind of work through how to get operations to give developers just enough access to do the things they needed to do. I don't want godlike access to everything. One of my colleagues very nearly destroyed all our production VMs with a badly written script. I don't want the possibility to even do that. That's bad. Protect me from my errors. And we needed to prove to operations that we cared about operability, because their instinctive reaction is, what do you care? You're not the one that's going to be woken up for this. And you can only do that, really, by talking to people and showing them stuff, and having people on your team who can see that you are doing this all the time, and they can go back and say, yes, but they are spending time on alerts and monitoring and documentation. If you're going to do DevOps as a team, then you have to be able to build a system that you feel you can support. And that means you have to be the people that make the decision about what you're building. So who makes the technology decisions? At the FT, it used to be that we had an architecture review board. So you wanted to build a new project, you'd write a document, you'd go to the board and they'd say, well, you want to use a messaging system, this other team use Kafka, you should use Kafka because then we've got 2 teams using Kafka. Well, maybe that isn't right for your requirements. Maybe it will slow you down. And you need to be free to say, no. My program had several decisions that came to us from there that caused us quite a lot of pain. And it took us probably a year before we basically sat down and said, this thing that you wanted us to use isn't something we can operate. We had an RDF data store that just fell over a lot. We said, well, do you know what? We can't go live with that. We're going to change to a graph database that we feel has a better chance of staying up overnight. And we did that, and it made a massive difference to us in terms of the amount of time we spent coaxing our systems through. So you need to let teams make those decisions. And this also includes the freedom not to use the things that your tooling team is building. Basically, if you force people to use something, it doesn't encourage people to build a useful thing. My colleague Matt Chadburn wrote a very good blog post about this. Basically saying, for a team, you should be able to choose to use something because it's easy to use and it's ready and you can do it quickly. And it shouldn't be based on politics. He also points out in this blog post that internal tooling teams should have a massive advantage in terms of building the thing that you would want to use, because they only have to meet your requirements and they're able to talk to you all the time. So frankly, if you're a team that's offering services internally and you don't have anyone using it, you need to think about why you're building the wrong thing. And this is about tooling team realizing that they have customers. They should be talking to those customers too. And what this has led to at the FT is a move away from platforms. Platforms kind of corral you into doing everything through that, and they make a lot of decisions for you. But tools and standards let you pick the things that work for you. So the standards are things like, we have a health check standard, where we say if you are building a web application, you have to have a response on a particular endpoint that says in a particular JSON format whether this application is healthy. And then we can plug it into monitoring and we can do what we like with it. We don't really care how you implement the standard. But the tooling team have written libraries in the languages we commonly use. So, if you're doing Java, you just use that library. And tools generally have been moving towards being APIs that people can use however they like. Because they have to persuade people to use them, they're well documented. This is for creating change requests and release logs. And it isn't, so I can do this at command line, and they also provide integrations. So the tooling team had some shell scripts you could use in Jenkins jobs. Recently I said to them, yeah, but I'd really like to create a release log on merge on GitHub. And they've written a webhook for that. In fact, I think it goes live today. So they're responding to what I'm asking for, which makes a massive difference. So the third big challenge for us, the thing that's involved a lot of discussions for the last year, is out-of-hours support. We run an internal conference, technology conference, once a year, and we do panels on subjects people feel strongly about. This year we did one on 24/7 support, how DevOps are we? And it really became an operations versus developers argument, and people felt very strongly about it. So we knew we had lots of work to do, and we've been working on this ever since. And the thing to understand is people get really worried about this stuff. So operations teams are worried that you're going to choose technologies they don't know about, or that they're going to lose their job because, oh, this DevOps thing, there won't be a role for operations. And they worry about potentially they won't get called, and the money that they're used to having from being called is no longer there. And developers worry. They worry about doing a day's work and then having to be available in the evening to do support. And I think that it's very easy to say, well, you know, you build it, you run it, you should be available, but people have other commitments. Perhaps they've got children or other caring responsibilities. Maybe they just have a hobby and they don't want to spend 1 week in 3 chained to a laptop because a system might break that they've built so that it probably won't break. So you have to address that as well. There are lots of reasons, and I think you can't just say, well, they're not committed enough if people don't want to do it. So what have we done? Well, we still have first and second line support. So we have first line on shift, second line on call. And a lot of people would say that means we're not doing DevOps, which I don't agree with. But because I think there's an issue here, which is we have a lot of services that depend on each other. And actually, it's quite hard to work out when something goes wrong, what's the cause? You know, is it the CMS, or the publishing platform, or the APIs, or maybe it's the API gateway, or maybe it's the website? Having someone to look at a whole wall of things going red and work out what the cause is pretty useful. Second line support, well, they're now in our teams, so they know quite a lot about the stuff we're building. And because of this, we've been able to say to our development teams, well, TechOps will be there in front of a laptop within a certain amount of time. You just potentially need to be able to answer your phone and suggest some things to them. So we're not expecting you to be within 20 minutes of a laptop, we're just expecting one of you to be able to answer your phone and help out. But what works for one team doesn't work for another. We have some small teams that are maybe 3 or 4 people. They can't possibly take on the fact that they might get called. They'd be 1 week in 3, they'd be worried about being called. And for those teams, there's an option for them to just basically choose well-known technologies, document the hell out of it, and just pass it over to first and second line support. For larger teams like my team, we've basically picked our own way of doing it. So my team decided we'd split into 3 groups, so you knew 1 week in 3 you might get called, and we'd ask second line to just pick from a list of numbers and keep trying if they can't get through. Second line support hate that because they don't get certainty. So there's a lot of debate there, and we're trying to see what will happen. But I think you have to not be afraid to try these things out. You can spend too much time talking about how you're going to do it and not just try something. So Jeff Bezos recently talked about 2 different types of decisions. The kind of decision that's irreversible. You do it, it's very hard to unwind. I would say Brexit. You know, once we serve Article 50, it's going to be a lot of effort to ever get back in. The other type of decision is like walking through a door. You can turn around and go back. And he said one of the problems companies have is they treat every decision as though it's irreversible. So they have a heavyweight decision-making process. You should be able to identify the 2 types and just try things. So why would someone do out-of-hours support for free? Because they have pride in their work and they know they've built something that's really unlikely to fall over. They might do it because the company says, yeah, you know, you can choose this cool new language, but you have to be able to support it because other people can't. I think you can find a balance, but you need to not take advantage of people's pride in their work. So what difference has DevOps made at the FT? Well, a new service can go into production in minutes, not months. 0 downtime deployments are normal, and the major advantage of this is they're always done in hours. So if something goes wrong, everyone you need to talk to is there. And that makes a massive difference. It's minutes from saying this was fine in test to going live in production. And we have teams that are doing continuous deployment, so they merge to master, it's live, and normally behind a feature flag. We're not doing that on my team because we're more concerned about data consistency, but we can still get it out there really quickly. And you know, we are releasing a lot. It's about 150 times a month. I think it's about 200 times as often as we used to release 4 years ago. And this is our new process. We don't really have a defined process. I had to create this but effectively, most of it is automated, and the bits that are manual are one-line Git commands, pretty much. Bear in mind, this is what it used to look like. This is what it looks like now. It's a lot easier for people to understand, and there are far fewer places for it all to go wrong. We built our Google AMP integration in weeks, and we were able to do that because we had a platform with APIs, and because we had the ability to set up new systems with all the necessary monitoring very, very quickly. So, we talked about why DevOps was a good thing for us at the time we started looking at it, how we approached it, and also the hard stuff. And the hard stuff is really all about trust. Do operations trust developers? Do the technology leadership trust teams to make the right decisions? And mostly with trust issues, it's all about communication. So you really need to spend a lot of time talking to people and showing that you have the same interests at heart. So it's been a really positive thing for us, and we've still got a long way to go, but it's helped us move so much faster, and the frustrations are not now about, oh, I can't get this out into production for 6 weeks. So that's it. Thank you.